Welcome, everyone, to this wonderful talk by Professor LeBlanc from the University of Moncton. The talk, Professional Translators and Technologies in a Minority Setting, Examples from the Canadian Context. And it's a pleasure to have Professor LeBlanc with us. He's a full professor in the Department of Translation and Modern Languages and an Associate Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Moncton in New Brunswick, Canada, not such a coincidence that it's also New Brunswick. Yes. And he, apart from his academic background, he was also like a professional translator in another life, right? In a previous life. He holds an MA in Translation Studies and a PhD in Sociolinguistics, so it's a very interesting combination. And that actually allows him to focus on the sociological aspects and the work of translators and translation practices in an increasingly automated working environment, as well as on language policies and the role of translation in bilingual settings. So we're super excited to have you, and I'm just giving you the word to start the talk. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Laura. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here virtually with you tonight. Of course, I would have loved to have been in New Brunswick, New Jersey, but that will come one day for sure. So thank you again for the invitation. It's really my pleasure to be here. So I've got a 40 to 45 minute talk tonight. I've gone through it once, and then I'd be more than happy to answer questions. I'm broaching several different topics, but they're all really linked. So at the end of my presentation, what I hope to do is try to link them all together. So I've entitled my talk, Professional Translation and Technologies in a Minority Setting, Examples from the Canadian Context. What's really interesting, as Laura was saying, is that I am in the province of New Brunswick, Canada. You are in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Very interesting. So I think it's the first time that this actually happens. So my presentation has 4 parts, really. The first part will be focused on the sociolinguistic context, translation in New Brunswick. I'm not sure if any of you know where New Brunswick is, so I've got a map for you. I'll try to explain to you why it is that we translate so much in New Brunswick. Well, what are the, talk about the needs. In part 2, I will look at the important role of translation, professional translation in this officially bilingual province of Canada. As translation really is geared towards the French-speaking minority, it plays really an important role in the dissemination of French, and in fact, in the survival of French in many respects. So to what extent can translation in and of itself play a role in the development and dissemination of a minority language and community? In part 3, I'll talk about several ethnographic research projects I've conducted in professional translation services and agencies in New Brunswick. I will pay attention to the translators' changing relationship with technologies, as well as the translators' perception of their work, the role they play within the linguistic community, and also their professional status. And in the end, I'll conclude and wrap it all up, and I'll discuss some of the shifts that we're witnessing in the translation landscape in New Brunswick as well as in Canada. But first of all, a bit of information on the sociolinguistic setting. So here's a map of Canada, the official government map sanctioned by the Queen. So you can see the small province of New Brunswick here. It's in French, Nouveau Brunswick. In the eastern part of the province, it actually shares a border with Maine. We're not actually that far. I could take my car and probably make it to New Brunswick, New Jersey in probably less than 24 hours. We're used to long distances in Canada as well. This is the province of New Brunswick. So you have the state of Maine here, and then you have Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Just to give you an idea, it's a very small province. We don't even have 1 million inhabitants, probably close to 750,000, so very small. About 2/3 of the population have English as a mother tongue, 64.8%, and about 1/3 would have French as a mother tongue. Not many people have other languages other than English or French as their mother tongue, but that is changing tremendously with immigration, especially in the last 15 years. So that is very interesting as well. New Brunswick's Francophone speaking, French speaking population is scattered throughout the province, but mostly focused on the northern and eastern parts. What's really interesting are the rates of English-French bilingualism, because English and French are the official languages of New Brunswick. I will talk about that a bit later. The Francophone, the rates of bilingualism are very, very asymmetrical. So we have the minority language speakers, Francophones. I would say probably close to 70% of them are bilingual, so it means they speak English and French. But when you go to the side of the majority speakers, what we call them Anglophones, very typically Canadian way to say it, only about 16% of the population speaks French. So the rates are quite asymmetrical. A few words on the social and historical context, because it is important to have a grasp of what what has played out historically. So without spending too much time on the history, suffice it to say that in the 60s and 70s, New Brunswick was the scene of conflict and dissension between the two main linguistic groups, the main linguistic communities, Anglophones and Francophones. In 1969, we sort of saw a reversal of things. The Official Languages Act of New Brunswick was enacted. Actually, the same year, the Official Languages Act of Canada was enacted, so in 1969. And Francophones, who lagged behind economically, have made tremendous progress since then on many fronts, educationally, socially, economically. So the gap between the two groups, the dominant English-speaking group and the French-speaking minority, has shrunk considerably. We now have French language schools throughout the province. We have our French language university, that is where I teach. We have healthcare in both official languages. We have our Official Languages Act. We have policies. And in fact, the government has found a way to make money with bilingualism by capitalizing on the bilingual capacity of its population. They're now touting the added value and the economic advantages of bilingualism, and it sort of became a selling features for attracting multinational firms and businesses. So that led, for example, to the creation of customer service centers, call centers, which made use of the region's bilingual workforce. So bilingualism, which was once sort of derided by the majority, has become a valued resource that has to be, was to be valued, marketed, and capitalized on. So sort of a reversal of fortunes. So after 50 years or more of official bilingualism, however, there are still important discrepancies between the majority and the minority groups. English remains a strong majority language, largely used, sometimes exclusively in business and industry. In government, unfortunately, English remains the main language of work, and Francophones have few opportunities to use French in the workplace, except perhaps in French language schools and institutions that have French as a language of work. I won't get into the details, but this is what we would call a classic diglossic situation. And translation is heavily relied upon to achieve this supposed equality between the two official linguistic communities. Just a few words on the government of New Brunswick's translation policy. Our government has its own in-house translation bureau, which employs many translators. We have an Official Languages Act that requires us to translate, to publish in English and French all official documents, from driver's licenses to acts and policies to anything that is produced by the government. So the government has its own translation bureau, and more than 90% of translation is done from English into French. So that is very interesting in and of itself. Very little translation is done from French into English, which shows you that really only a small fraction of texts are actually produced in French. So you have a definition of what the Translation Bureau does. It assists government in fulfilling its obligations for bilingual services as outlined in the Official Languages Act of New Brunswick. So they provide written translation, simultaneous interpretation for conferences, seminars, and other gatherings, consecutive interpretation for court proceedings, and administrative tribunal hearings and other linguistic services. So a lot of our students in our translation program end up working for the government of New Brunswick, and as well as the government of other provinces, and of course the government of Canada, which is a major employer of translators with exceptional working conditions and compensation as well. So for those reasons, as you can see, the Francophone community, French language speakers, rely a lot on translation. So the quality of translation into French is of utmost importance for the Francophone community. So what I'd like to do now is just perhaps take a few minutes to talk about translation and linguistic minorities before we delve into my past research into the workplace and translation technologies, because I'd like to try to link all of those aspects at the end of my presentation. So what I'd like to do is just maybe take a few minutes to talk about the role that translation can play, not always, but can play in minority settings. As I've said, translation is, some of us call it a necessary evil for the Francophone community, but as several definitions of minority exist, I'd like to explain for the purposes of my talk tonight that I define minority as a cultural or political position that is subordinate, whether the context that so defines it is local, national, or global. It's just one of the several definitions. This one is taken from Venuti. As Turi posits, it's an established fact that minority language communities have been turned into translating in critical periods, while adding that translation has contributed to the development of these languages and their cultures. In those instances, translation can play an instrumental role in, as I've said at the beginning, the dissemination and the preservation of a minority language. It can fulfill, for example, different functions in the target language, especially in cases where there is a strong majority language, in our case English, and it can have a displacing effect, displacing impact on the minority language and its speakers. In cases of such asymmetry between two languages, if a minority group wishes to resist displacement by the majority language of the community, it can seek to defend itself by strengthening each and every domain of language use. That again is from Turi. I just have one, sorry. As you can see, I won't read the whole quote, but he starts by saying, translating may serve as a means for both actual preservation and development of a language and enhancing self-esteem in its speakers, which is a necessary prerequisite for successful results. So in that sense, I think if we take the example of New Brunswick, we are in some instances in a situation that is very similar to what Turi has described. So what he highlights here are really the positive effects that translation can have in the development of minority languages. We know that translation can have the opposite effect as well in many situations, but in this case, we can see that when translation is relied upon to that extent, it can have some positive effects. Along the same lines, I think of Michael Cronin, who says, that translation can be of utmost importance for linguistic minorities in the sense that it can be instrumental, again, in the development of the language itself. He does, however, point to an important problem that linguistic minorities often face. For example, and I quote when he says, minority languages have a fundamentally paradoxical relationship with translation, as languages operating in a multilingual world with vastly accelerated information flows from dominant languages. They must translate continually in order to retain their viability and relevance as living languages. Yet translation itself may endanger the very specificity of those languages that practice it, particularly in situations of diglossia, and we are in a situation of diglossia here. The situation of translation and the culture of a minority language is therefore highly ambiguous. The ambiguity is partly related to the functions of translation in the minority language culture. So what Cronin emphasizes here is the asymmetrical relationship that languages find themselves in, and the resultant power relations that are established between them. Often, as Cronin points out, translation is unfortunately unidirectional, or if not, heavily dominant in favor of the minority language, such as the case of Irish Gaelic in Ireland, French in Canada, Italian in Switzerland, and we could go on. So overall, the relationship between the source and target texts on a microscopic level may be uncovered through an examination of translation and translation practices and processes. That's what I've tried to do in some of my research as well. What is revealed in many cases when you start digging are the power relations that are often asymmetrical, of course, between the languages and thus the linguistic communities. I referred to Timotsko and Gensler when they talk about the power turn in translation studies. Of course, translation may allow the dominant language to maintain its position of power and to serve to promote linguistic and cultural imposition, but it can also, on the other hand, be used to combat domination. One last quote that I have here from Garcia Gonzalez, the role of translation in minority settings is the role it plays in language normalization processes. That is, the attempts to cause a language to be normally used in all spheres of speech community. It can be of equal or even more importance for such languages than the communicative function itself. I would say that this is probably the case of French in Canada, in provinces other than Quebec. Quebec is obviously in a league of its own with French as the sole official language. So it's a situation we can't compare. So I will conclude here for the moment, but at the end I will come back to translation and minorities. But first, a drink of water. If there are any questions so far on the translation and minorities, I am, just let me know. We can stop and continue. I'm very flexible and used to being interrupted. So really, it's not an issue. If not, I can delve into some examples of my research in the workplace if you're okay with that. Good. All right. So now, what I'd like to do now is talk to you about some of the research that I've conducted in the workplace. Really, I would say that most of my research, whether it be in translation studies or sociolinguistics, really has pretty much all been conducted in the workplace. I'm a big fan of the ethnographic approach. It's not my only approach, but it's really something that I quite like. I've been really conducting research in the workplace since about 2005. I'm interested in translation studies and sociolinguistics, and they've led me to different environments. Today, I'll talk more about my research in translation. I've spent a lot of time in translation agencies or translation services, as well as government offices in New Brunswick and other places in Canada. During my first foray into a translation environment, which that was probably about 2005. It was very informal. I was conducting sort of a small research project. And I spent some time with a colleague in a large Canadian translation firm. And really, this research was just sort of exploratory in nature. And really, what I was interested in was more of the sociolinguistic dynamics of this specific workplace that we had named Technocom at the time. But what really emerged from this research, and this is the beauty of ethnography because you never know what you will uncover, were the changes, in fact, really the considerable changes that had occurred in the world of professional translation between, say, the early 2000s and 2005, 2008. What we noticed, and we were aware of that, but what we really noticed was that there had been considerable changes to workflow management and the use of technology, of course, among other things, which really led to a division of labor and really a considerable streamlining of processes. And in fact, in this specific firm that we looked into, the changes that we observed had reduced the translators' tasks considerably over the years. And it led to tensions between translators and management. So really, even though initially that's not what we were looking into, that's what really caught our attention. And it raised important questions. Translators were not happy. They were talking about all those changes, what it meant for them. And I thought at that point, well, I'll finish this first research project and then I'll delve into the workplace more specifically. So that brought me to my workplace investigation, which was conducted in between 2012 and, well, 14, but really 15, and then a follow-up study more informally in 2019. My study really focused on technology, mostly the use of translation memory systems, TMs. Machine translation was used as well, but not systematically, so I was not able to compare. So I really focused on translation memory at that point. But in 2019, I sort of started looking into machine translation as well. I was really interested in the translation processes, the workflows, the practices, the business practices, especially the evolution and the changes. And really, I was also interested in the translator satisfaction and translator status. As in Canada, translation is always, well, I mean, since the 70s and 80s, been, you know, a profession that was, you know, well regarded, with, you know, government translators really have always had great working conditions and compensation, and had worked, you know, a lot to earn the respect of other government employees, for example. But things were slowly changing, and I was really interested in that. So what I was really interested in was really talking to translators, interviewing them, observing them at work. I wanted to see how they interacted with their tools. I wanted to question them. I wanted to measure their perceptions and examine all the changes in their work environment. So as I've said, it was entirely ethnographic. We see that it's over the years, we've seen that ethnography is really a versatile method. We've been using it more and more in translation studies. I've been using it in my research in sociolinguistics for years, but not so much in translation. I looked for this specific study, into 3 translation firms and services. I'll call them LSPs, language service providers. Some of them were government, some of them were private. They were mid-sized, employed, probably about 35 full-time employees at the time of the fieldwork. They had junior translators, intermediate translators, senior translators, revisers, terminologists, proofreaders, managers, technicians, and so on. Most of the work was in Canada's official languages, English and French. And I spent probably about a month full-time in each of these LSPs, and I'll provide some of the basic conclusions here. So these are the 3 LSPs that I looked into, 2012 to 14, and again 2019. So these names are fictitious, of course. Traduco, you won't find it if you Google it. So it had about 50 to 60 employees. They've been using translation memory software progressively over the years. General and specialized translation, conducted 17 semi-directed interviews, 7 shadowing sessions with translators at work, and about 100 hours on site. So the next firm was Lingexport. You have, I won't read all of that, but you can take a quick look at what I did. So I was trying to compare, spend as much time as, in LSP 1 as I did in LSP 2 and 3. So that's what I wanted to do. And the last one was Global Lingua, which is a larger firm. And there you go, all these interviews. It took a long time to gather all that information. So a significant amount of data through observation and interviews. In total, more than 50 interviews, 300 hours spent on site, no research assistant at the time. A lot, I don't know how I did it, but anyway, one day I'll be back, but maybe with research assistants. A lot of informal conversations. And to be honest, I found that with ethnographic research, these are the best. I mean, when they go for a beer after work, that's when you get all your information. So get out your notes. A lot of precious information. So I was able to gather a lot of information on their working conditions, the workflows, the requirements, and all that. So what I'd like to do, just briefly, just one aspect of my work, I'd like to take a look at the pros and cons according to translators. But before that, just a quick view of what kind of work they do and how they use the technology, how they use the technology at that point. So the use of translation memories in the workplace, they were used for all types of texts in all three LSBs, with a few exceptions, speeches, government, political speeches, highly confidential texts, advertising, they weren't used for that. The goal was to build new memories, feed new data, of course. The practices with respect to the reuse and recycling of existing translations and, the full matches, the exact matches, all about that. The substantial fuzzy matches were, well, let's just say that they, they raised concerns among translators. I was even surprised myself. I was a translator myself for several years, loved technology, tried pretty much everything. I'm not a translator anymore. I don't have time to translate except for my classes, but I myself was surprised to see some of the practices that had been implemented in some of those LSBs. For example, I noticed that translators were instructed not to touch anything, any exact or full match. Same thing at Ling Export. The rationale was that these translations had been produced by other professionals and delivered to clients. They are reusable as is. And at Traduco, it was a free-for-all. Translators could do what they wanted with full and exact matches, and the TM was used like any other tool, and the use of professional judgment was encouraged. So that was really interesting because I had two LSBs that worked, one way, and then one that did it completely differently. I'll talk about my brief incursion into those workplaces in 2019 in a few minutes. So if I summarize how they felt about the use of TMs, translation memories, so perhaps very quickly, the pros and advantages of translation memories. They thought it was a great tool. It helped increase productivity, obviously. They allowed better consistency. We all know that. They eliminated boring and repetitive work. They function as searchable databases, as a bilingual concordancer, and they could sometimes serve as a pedagogical tool, the sharing of solutions, subject knowledge repository. So as we know, they do have a lot of advantages, as we know. The cons, if you want, or the disadvantages of TMs, according to translators. The first thing that they would tell me is that it would change the relationship with the text. What was really interesting here is that I talked to translators who'd been translating for almost 30 years. So they had known, some of them had been using typewriters, go figure, and now they were using translation memory and machine translation as well. So that was very interesting to see the evolution. They really talked a lot about the segmentation that bothered them quite a lot. They deemed that it was a barrier to creativity. A lot of them had chosen translation because they really wanted to focus on creative work. They love to write. They do not like to be told how to write. So that's a personal opinion, of course. A lot of them deemed that it made them lazy, more passive. It was sort of a one-stop shop. Some of them felt that it had an effect on their natural reflexes, like a dulling of the natural ability. Beginner translators became too dependent on the translation on the TM. They were sometimes polluted, of course, and they contributed sometimes to the propagation of errors. So the other cons that I didn't list here were not so much linked with the system itself, but more with the business and administrative practices that followed TM implementation in these LSBs. So this is really what I'd like to focus on now, on the practices, not so much the technical aspects, but more the practices that were implemented and that were really a cause for concern among translators. So the first one I'd like to look into are, and then I have excerpts from my my interviews that I used in one of my articles as well. So the first aspect that they focused on were the impact on the productivity requirements. So in 3 of the firms and services that I examined, the time allotted for translators for translating a text was reduced significantly if the translated text, the target text had exact or full matches, and reduced in the case of fuzzy matches and internal repetitions, all of course to in the goal of maximizing productivity. So that is commonplace. It's been commonplace since translation memories exist, but it was new to a lot of them. They had never really worked that way. It was a paradigm shift for some of them. They felt that the word that translation was becoming a word or a sentence replacement activity. There's no context anymore, and they felt that really that was a major change for them. So you have a few I won't read all of those. I mean, you have them in front of you. Some of them would say quality used to trump quantity. It's the opposite now. The last one, the way we calculate productivity requirements based on full and exact matches is oftentimes misleading. That's what makes translators react. I have a few other excerpts here that you can read. What was of concern oftentimes is that no one ever asked them how they felt about those changes. As you can see, what's even stranger is that no one ever asked us our opinion or consulted us on these matters. And we are the language professionals here. So that was a major concern for a lot of translators. Now, another aspect that really struck me was the impact on the translator's control over the target text. When it was one of the main bones of contention among translators, is that they are subjected to existing translations. They have to reuse whatever they find as is. As you can see in the excerpts here, we've been explicitly instructed to accept as is what had already been translated by us or by others. So they're subjected, according to them. Those are the words they use. I'm using some of the words that come out in the interviews. They're not opposed to recycling as is. What they seem to want is a word to say over what they decide to recycle or not. So, for example, one of them says the change in practice came too quickly. So you have this technology coming in, technology that's able to do wonderful things, but it's the practices that have followed that really struck a chord with them. So let me just see, I probably have a few more excerpts here that you can read. We're subjected to existing translations without having any idea of the conditions under which they were produced, or knowing whether these translations were even revised. So they're called upon to accept changes, not changes, but translations out of context. So these were things that were brought up in the interviews. Now, what really came up in the interviews as well after, the translators were, they were semi-directed interviews. They were asked to comment on the changes they witnessed, but a lot of them commented on their professional satisfaction. We can see it from the excerpts. For many, this increased automation was seen as worrisome, especially when coupled with expectations of increased productivity. I saw recurring comments about, translating in a box, subordinated to existing translations, the work being mechanical, the reflexes being, not being the same, downgraded to worker status. You see it in the quote that I have here for you. So some of them were actually wondering what was going to happen to the profession. They were seeing a narrowing of their role, a shift in professional status. Some of them used worker status, commodification or commoditization, production line. So that really sort of worried me in some ways when I heard, senior translators referring to their work in such a way. So here you have the, I mentioned translating in a box, worker status. You have these examples here. This pre-translation is the depressing part of the job. We've lost a tremendous amount of autonomy. The word autonomy came up frequently as well. And this one, 17b, there is no longer any room for the artistic types, the creative types, those who in the end come to translation because they love language. Those who will get the jobs and will probably enjoy the work are techies who are good enough with words. And I thought that was really interesting to see. And some of them, were quite humorous when they talked to me. So these are just some of the excerpts from my interviews. So what we see really here, let me just move on to the next slide here. They indicate the translators working at all three TSBs, it shows that they've witnessed tremendous change in the last years. And, that's to be expected. I too, in my profession have, I've witnessed tremendous change, and that's to be expected. But translators at the first two LSBs, Lingexport and Global Lingua, have seen some changes that are consistent with what Daniel Guadec has described as, an industrialization or of professional translations. In these, LSBs, those two, Lingexport and Global Lingua, the markers of industrialization as defined by Guadec are patent. We do see them. Among the most visible are probably what Guadec calls the process and product standardization, the use of productivity enhancing tools, as well as a certain division of labor. So I did see that. And they are consistent with also what Brian, I don't know if you've heard of Brian Mossop, a Canadian translator and teacher as well. He observed that in his studies of the Canadian Government's Translation Bureau. He did a historical study of the Translation Bureau since its inception in the 1930s. Very, very interesting. And he contrasts the different periods where translation before 1995, according to Mossop, was done for social and political and linguistic reasons. Very interesting. And now, according to Mossop, it's more of a profit-generating activity, even for the government. So it used to have a role that was focused on the sociocultural aspects of the translation activities, but now it's more of a business-like model, not so much to bring about cultural change or to bilingualize the public service, but more of a way of making business. The government of Canada expects its own translation bureau to make money, so that's a major shift. It's not to have texts of equal values for both linguistic communities, but in the end to make money. So we've seen these shifts as well, even on the government level. An important quote by Elizabeth Marshman from the University of Ottawa, who says language professionals who perceive an effect on their control over the work and working environment as a result of technologies tend to feel more rather than less in control of many important areas of their work, which is consistent with the fact that those users of technologies overall view these technologies as assets. So what we're seeing is really not so much the tools in and of themselves, but more how we use the tools, and especially the practices that have followed. And in some cases, as I've described earlier, some of those changes in practices were really a great cause of concern for translators. So I think these are all issues that need to be addressed, not just by translators, as they have very little power, but by academics, by LSBs, especially by professional associations, perhaps also by tool designers and industry. Just a few words as well on my follow-up study. So I was fortunate enough in 2019 to, I didn't conduct a full-fledged study in 2019. I didn't have time at that point. I'm now in an administrative position as associate dean. So really my teaching and research, not that it has, I still have research projects, but I'm not as much devoted to my research as I was probably 10 years ago. But in 2019, I was fortunate enough to spend time again in those three LSBs. And it was really interesting because they still are using translation memory software, but they're also using machine translation as well. What is really interesting is that they are not forced to use machine translation at all. They are, it is a tool among others. They are encouraged to use it when they feel that it can be useful. I think what we've seen with translation memories, the disgruntled, they're quite disgruntled. I think that the LSBs have understood that, if there is a tool, let the professionals decide when they can be useful and how they should be used. And I think that freedom that they're being given with respect to machine translation has really made them a lot happier. Some of the practices that I've described are still in effect, the enforced recycling. They've loosened up to some extent, but a lot of them now we're using both together. As you know, they're using the memory and as well as the machine translation. So that I found to be quite interesting. They're given more freedom to use it in a way that perhaps they can have more control over their work. They're not, a lot of people ask me when I talk about my research is it that they don't like technology? It's not at all what I saw. They have nothing against technology itself at all. Well, maybe a few, but in general, they welcome technology. They feel that it helps them quite a lot. It's mostly the practices that have followed that have bothered them in the end. So I'm up to 40 minutes. I'd just like to take maybe a few minutes just to conclude and to tie all these aspects together. So what I've tried to do, at least in the first half, is discuss the role that translation plays for linguistic minorities by focusing on the role of professional translation into French in the Canadian context. I tried to illustrate the complexities of translation in linguistic minority settings. There are naturally countless other examples from all across the globe that would illustrate altogether different dynamics and different power relations. But as Cronin says, each minority language is involved in a particular translation dynamic, a dynamic that varies, of course, from one language to another. So the picture that I've painted here would be very different in the case of a minority language that is not perhaps like French, a major world language, or of minority language that has no official recognition at all, or for example, most of Canada's numerous indigenous languages which have no protection at all, unfortunately. So while there is a desirability for a theory of minority language translation, much work remains to be done in order to grasp really the multitude and complexity of comparable situations worldwide. So the example of professional translation as practiced in the Canadian context does allow us, according to me, to shed light on the role that translation can play in a minority setting. Translation, or more specifically the directionality of translation, is to a large extent, I would say, a barometer of the asymmetrical linguistic relations and the weight languages carry in a given social and political context. In many cases, members of the linguistic majority, at least in the Canadian context, worry very little about the effects of translation on their daily lives or their community, on their language, because really they rarely have to translate, or whatever they read is, it's not a translation, it's drafted in their own language. It never has to do with their rights or the dissemination of their language. In the eyes of the majority, translation is really for the minority. So just to show that really it does not play the same role for, whether you're part of the majority or the minority community. So as we've seen, working conditions for translators have changed tremendously in the last 30 to 40 years in the Canadian context, and more changes are to come with this, industrialization and globalization. Volumes of work have increased, deadlines are tightened, and translation has not been shielded from the effects of globalization. Technology is now at the core of the translating profession, and professional translators are feeling the effects of the shifting business practices that are being observed in many translation environments across the world. So these changes are of concern to translators and also to members of the linguistic minorities, as they are the principal consumers of translation. And as such, it is, perhaps, and I quote Cronin, unwise and unhelpful to sunder technological developments from the political and economic context of language use. And in the end, although we've been witnessing more and more interest in minority language translation in recent years, I think it's our role as researchers to investigate and reflect upon the role of translation in minority settings, and to look at the effects, positive or negative, that it plays for all minority language communities. So it's 1944 on my computer, I think, yeah, 1844 in New Jersey. So I will conclude there. I know that I speak very fast. I apologize ahead of time. I've covered a lot today. Only part of the research I conduct in translation studies and sociolinguistics. And if there are any other aspects that you would like to touch upon, please feel free to do so. So I will stop, conclude, and let you ask questions.
Great. I don't know if they can hear me.
I will stop sharing. There you go.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. Sorry, I think I muted
Thank you very much.
That was fascinating. So I will open it like for questions now, if anyone wants to or any comments or questions or anything.
Absolutely, anything.
Yeah, anything.
Related or unrelated, it doesn't matter.
You can use the chat too.
Okay, yes. I do have the chat on here, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask your questions. I know that the Canadian context is very different from the American context, and even within the United States, it varies a lot from one state, one region to another. Okay. So
can I make a question? I was trying to get students
yes.
out of the class.
I'll go next.
Go ahead.
Thanks a lot for a fascinating talk. I've been following your research, of course, because we were a lot in some areas, and the ethnographic research. Yes. Like you said, you have no research assistance for all that ethnographic research, and really mesmerized all that. And I have several questions. I could have several questions about the beginning of the talk, at the beginning and the middle, the stuff, and we're aware. And I was wondering if you could expand very briefly, because like whether the autonomy that translators felt now with machine translation in your studies, because I felt like all the negative aspects of like translation memory use and the lack of autonomy and the imposition and all these research that you've done and other researchers in Poland and many other places. I feel also Maureen, I can say her last name.
Dow. Yes.
Okay, she might be listening or something. But it's fascinating. But you said at the end that because machine translation, like when you started working on it, it was being optional, the post editing, which seems to have, when it's imposed, it seems to have the very same, like thing reading research about ethnographic workplace studies. It was sort of replicating what you did with translation memory. So it was like, the loss of creativity, blah, 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 and the same thing. But you said in your case that you felt that because it was optional, there was like a tool, they felt like more happier about it. Could you expand like just for a minute about what you found about that?
And that's something that I really want to look into in the coming year or two. I would like to return to those 3 or perhaps 4 LSPs. If I can finish my mandate as as associate, my term as associate dean, I could go back into the workplace. What I found is that the LSPs had sort of heard the disgruntlement and decided for some reason that they would let the translators use machine translation if they wanted to. So the translators felt that when they could take the text and use whatever software they were using and play with it without anyone having to tell them how much time it would need to take them, or how much what they could change or not. They felt that their autonomy, actually what they referred to as, I feel that my creative side can come out more, and that I don't have a manager who is not a translator, who has no knowledge of the linguistic aspects of the work, is telling me what to do. So I felt that they were sort of regaining an autonomy that they had lost with translation memory, which is really interesting, because I mean, we all know that machine translation, well, it's a whole other ballgame. It's a whole other way to proceed. Now, just a little sidebar. In one of the LSPs, what they're doing is using translation memory pretty much the same way they were using it 10 years ago. And the parts of the text, or for example, the sentences that have no matches, they're being sort of automatically translated by, that's the way we work now, automatically translation by the software, but the translator is free to sort of reject it. And some of them actually don't even want to see it. They have a way of saying, no, I don't want to see it. And if I feel that I want to see it, then I will choose and I will open up that little box and go see what is proposed. Just those little changes seem to have like an important effect on their, autonomy. So it's really something that I'll have to look into more closely. Yeah.
Very much. It seems like those, the cognitive friction is like, this is bothering me, I can take it off.
Yes.
Based on like cognitive friction, etc. It's very, very interesting. I don't know if anybody has questions. Have some more questions, but we have like literature leaders here. So John here. We have published literature leaders that probably question. It's a question on the chat, right? No.
There is a question by Hina. Could you repeat what the TM process is? The translation memory process.
Yes, translation memory. Yes. So you would like me to describe what exactly translation memory is? Is that what you would like me to do?
She said translation memory process, but she can maybe clarify.
Yeah, could you clarify? Because I don't want to, repeat something that perhaps.
Probably that. Yeah, what you said, and probably what like.
Okay.
Just the basic. Yeah.
The basics. Yeah. Yeah. So the translation memory is it's a they used to call it translation memory software. It really is a tool that we've been using for quite a number of years in the translation world. It's what it is sort of a database. What you do is you feed your database with your translated texts, target text, and as well as your source text. And then it compares them side by side. And what it does is for your future translations, you submit your text and it goes into your database and it tells you what you've done before. And it just, sort of suggests, for example, you've translated a part of this text last week. So would you like to recycle what you said last week? Or would you like to recycle a part of this sentence or a certain word or a full sentence or a paragraph? So it's a tool that really it's a tool that I love personally. I've used TMs for research and as on a personal level as well. It just pretty much allows you to avoid a lot of repetitive work. For example, it allows you to consult a large database, and when you are able to use it freely as a tool, it's a wonderful tool, really. It's just a repository of texts, and it just allows you to recycle a lot. For example, if you're translating a 300-page catalog, a lot of the same things are coming up, not very challenging. So it just allows you to recycle what you've already done or somebody else has already done. What they really didn't like, the translators that I interviewed, is that when they were being forced to recycle what had been done by others, and especially what they did not like or what they felt was not of good quality. So that was a very, very contentious issue. So TMs are just really huge databases that help translators recycle and use what has been done by others, as opposed to neuronal machine translation, which is a whole other ballgame, of course. Yeah, and the two are used together as well. So that's fascinating. Mm-hmm.
Super, thank you.
You're
so
welcome.
Much. So I actually had a question myself.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, thank you again. I thought it was like super interesting. Like my brain was like connecting all these ideas, and actually, like I know the Canadian context is very, you mentioned it's different because
yes.
Like to other contexts, but I mean I couldn't like help thinking of our situation here.
Mm-hmm.
This is like in the States in general and in New Jersey. Where we have like a big Spanish or Spanish-speaking population and other languages. So one question would be like very general, like if you think there's like takeaways from that, your studies in the Canadian context to other contexts where like in the case of Spanish or other languages, they are not official, they have not official status. Mm-hmm. But how like translation, which is done a lot, right? Like I mean, like Miguel and I, we constantly get like requests for translation, and they're like, like everything, like the state is basically the translating a lot of the materials. So that's one question, I guess. And the other question, I was also like very interested in this. Like at the beginning, you were mentioning how translation actually helped or helps, still helps for the self-esteem of the community, like the minority language community. And it's kind of like a way of continuing or like fostering the pride in the language and the culture.
Mhm.
And then on the other side, the technology has been having this negative, or not the technology, right? The practices have been having this negative influence on the self-perception of translators. And I was wondering if there is like a relationship in the sense that, like, you know, like because of that bad self-perception of translators, is it possible that, you know, like that self-esteem and pride in their own language is being affected too, in a way, you know, like, so that, you know, that good effect that we had at the beginning through translation, now because of the new practices, is actually being reversed because probably the quality is suffering from it, or the same translators are not feeling proud.
Right.
Right. So I don't know if there's like a connection there.
Yes, no, I'm going to start by your second question. Thank you, Laura. Really very, very pertinent. Indeed, I think that you're right. I think you've captured it. What I think translators working in the Canadian environment, especially when they work for government, and especially those who've been working there for a long time, they feel that they have a role, they have a social and political role. And their role really is to sort of protect the French minority, to produce texts that are of, you know, amazing quality, so that, you know, Francophones can have those texts, so that they're, you know, of equal quality to those produced by the English language majority. And what they feel, and indeed, really, when they see that their working conditions are changing and that they're forced to recycle horrible texts, or, you know, they feel that really what is threatened is not only their professional satisfaction or self-esteem, but really the survival of the minority community. Their work is, it's very much linked to the survival and to the respect of the minority community. So a lot of the comments were, you know, and I didn't have a lot today that were related to that, but a lot of them will tell me, you know, why are we here? Well, we're supposed to be, you know, sort of safeguarding the minority community by producing texts that are, you know, of equal quality to those produced in English. And now we have these horrible working conditions, and it's, you know, garbage in, garbage out. And they found that their social role was no longer being valued. So I think in some respects that for example, the Canadian government and perhaps the New Brunswick government have sort of become aware of that. And I think that that's why they're sort of relaxing the rules with regards to machine translation, and probably letting them decide on what is better. You know, the more your employees are happy at work and satisfied and feel that they are autonomous and that they play a role, even better, you know, a social and political role, well, I think the better the end product will be. So I think it's sort of a balance between both. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your questions. Yeah. Okay. Perfect.
Yeah. Yeah, like the other one was like about the takeaways, but I mean.
Oh yeah, the takeaways. Yeah, That. Sorry, I forgot the first one. Could you repeat that one? I don't think I jotted it that down.
I was just like in general, like, I mean, you mentioned that it's difficult to replicate, you know, because it's a
yes.
context. But I mean, we are in a, you know, I guess multilingual society here, especially like in New Jersey, which is the context that I'm more familiar with. And, you know, there is like an effort to translate a lot, like into Spanish, and mostly into Spanish, but other languages too. So, like I was curious in general if there are like things that we could learn from, even if it's official language, right? Like, but learn from the Canadian model, or I mean, I'm actually like interested in that self-perception, but this is probably like I'm rambling now, right? Like if translation is actually like gonna help, like translation into Spanish, which is, you know, what I work, is gonna help in that self-pride and the preservation of the Spanish-speaking community, right?
Right. And I guess that would be a question that I would probably have for you. Do you feel that, you know, professional translators working in the United States, translating, say into Spanish, would they feel that they play sort of a social role in the dissemination of Spanish, and that they have a role to safeguard and protect Spanish, or do they see it more as a, it's a job and this is what we do, and or do they have that pride, or how do they see their role? I think that would be a question that I would ask you, and that I'd be interested in in knowing.
I don't know. We have a research project there, right?
Yeah, there you go. We have one right there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I don't know if there are like more questions in the chat or anyone wants to comment.
Oh, I saw the deprofessionalization of translation. Yes. Yeah, that's one concern that a lot of translators had. And I think a lot of Canadian, especially government translators, have always known that they had probably some of the best working conditions in the world. So when they saw these things changing, just a second, that's my daughter calling me. Yeah, I'll call her back. Yeah, so I think when they saw their conditions change, they were sort of in disbelief, because they had probably worked to have, their unions, their professional associations, you've probably heard of Termium, those term banks that they had, all the work that was done, on English and French within the Translation Bureau. And really, the minute that some of these practices were implemented, translating in a box, recycling translations, for them, that was sort of, they were sort of seeing their downfall, and they were wondering, like, what is happening to our professional, and they were imagining a I'm having a hard time pronouncing that word, but anyway, it's right there in front of you, deprofessionalized. Yeah, that's a question that they would wonder about. They didn't conclude that that's what was happening, but they sort of wondered if that's the direction in which things were going. So I think that I'm now due for a study, 10 years later, to see exactly how they see that. And I know that, for example, in our own programs in Canada, there's a lot less interest in our translation programs. It's really quite interesting. And I don't know if machine translation, for example, or DeepL, it has an effect on that. But governments are still, looking to hire hundreds of well-paid translators. So it's sort of I find it quite interesting that, some of the younger people are not attracted to the profession, and there are, great jobs to be, on the market. But I'm just wondering if all this, those translate buttons everywhere give, people the impression that why would we need to study translation when really we have that software now? So that's another question that I'm worried about, like the evolution of the profession, and of course, who do we attract to the profession?
It might be the humanities in general, like in language learning.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Because in the UK, they're closing programs that have to do with like numbers and the interest. It's super interesting. I have to say that this area is quite active. In the area where we are, is quite active, and most of our students, if they want to have a job in translation, I mean, there's a lot of low-paying ones, of course, but like they want to get people, our students, get any job they want. Here, I will compare the Canadian government, for example, to the Department of Justice. They do hire like professional, that's like for the justice and some others. It kind of depends. It's like different. But this same conversation, I've been in ATA. You mentioned ATA.
Yes.
In Palm Springs, some years before, I remember some sessions that were very contentious about people discussing like how they make you lazy, everything, all the adjectives you have there.
Yes, exactly. I think we see them, they're recurring. Yeah.
They're a recurring issue, but they're gonna stay. Is there, good question, I know it's time is up. Is there any policy for other minority languages like Spanish or any other Chinese or any other immigration groups in your province, or immigration is kept low there?
No, immigration is very low, but it is changing quite a lot. We don't have any official policies, but there are practices. For example, we've been into this COVID thing for about 2 years, and what we've seen, and I think this is great, we've seen in New Brunswick translation into some of our Indigenous languages. I was so happy to see that. We'd never seen that before. So I was very, very happy to see that. And we also saw some of our texts translated in Spanish, in German, Portuguese, Arabic. So we are starting to, we're not training translators into those languages. That's a challenge as well. But we are, and the government of Canada has done the same as well. The government of Canada, however, does have within the Translation Bureau a multilingual division. So there are some texts that are translated into other non-official languages, and more texts are being translated in some, certainly not all, but some of our indigenous languages, which is amazing. I think that's probably one of the next fronts that we'll have to, and it's very delicate because of course you don't want, you want some of those communities to be producing their text as well, because you can't solely rely on translation. But at the same time, it is also a sign of, of respect. So we, so to answer your question, in New Brunswick, we don't have a policy yet, but I wouldn't be surprised that in the coming years that, we wouldn't have a policy for certain types of text in certain specific kinds of situations, especially natural, emergencies, natural disasters, things like that. So things are changing, and I'm happy to see that. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matthieu. Like in the
Thank
respect
you.
of time, we
Yes.
have to call it a day, but it was wonderful. It was super interesting. Yeah, I'm excited about. I'm excited about you going back to research so that you can update us like with new data. And yeah, thank you so much. Thank you everybody for attending. I'm gonna use just 30 seconds to spam you with like our new event. So we have tomorrow the Translate-a-thon.
Absolutely.
We have the Translate-a-thon. So anyone is invited to attend, right? You will find all our information under translation.rutgers.edu under events. You will find the information there. And then our next talk will be on March 9th. And it will be like on specializing in medical and health translation by Vicente Montag from the University Jaume I in Spain. Yeah, so that's that. Thank you so much. Yeah, happy afternoon, happy evening, everyone.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much once again. It was great to be with you, and I'll probably be at the next few sessions as well. All right.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Try to close this.
Bye, Laura.
Bye.